Hello, Sociology 322. We are here in week 10, and the topic for today is cults, church, and sex. Make sure you get this last word right, S-E-C-T-S. We could do a whole nother class on church and sex the other way, but let's just stick with this for now. The question really for today that unites all of this is, why do religious groups look the way they do? Okay, so we're going to take cults first. I had you read that chapter from Zimmerman, which is actually a really terrific chapter, because what he delves into is this question of the pop culture meaning of the phrase cults, and then the social scientific meaning of the phrase cults. And I also had you read that chapter about Scientology, because what it does is it immediately takes us to a group that we've heard about, that we know a little bit about, and it's definitely not a marginal in terms of having social power or in terms of kind of being violently opposed by any group. Scientology has kind of made its way as a cult that's very well kind of publicly known and in the mainstream. So that's a good example of us starting to kind of get a sense of how sociologists talk about cults in a way that's different from how others talk about cults. And let me give you some examples there. Oftentimes, when we hear about cults in the mainstream, we hear about strange ideas, or we hear about violence. You can think of David Koresh and the Branch Davidians in the 1990s. You can think of the Heaven's Gate cult and their mass cult of suicide in the 1990s. In the 1970s, you can think of Jim Jones and the killings of hundreds of people in the jungles of Guyana. Well, what's interesting about all these is that these groups pre-existed their violence, and we didn't hear a lot about for them for the part. So in thinking about cults, we want to get away from the idea that violence is what defines them, or that kind of control is what defines them. And what's important here is the word defines. And it's the case that cults, which we're going to talk about, the key features, but these are new ideas, they're new religious groups. And so it's almost always the case when something's new on the scene, particularly in the country where religion is so public, it's the case that public authorities and religious authorities are going to try and define cults, not allow cults to define themselves, but to say, like, those are strange or bizarre or need to be controlled or don't count as religion or need to be repressed. So we get in the mid to late 1800s with the Church of Latter-day Saints, which a lot of sociologists would argue was definitely a cult at the time in terms of being a new organization with a new religious idea. It was repressed by religious authorities and public authorities, and violently so, okay? So what we want to keep in mind here is always, as we talk about this idea of cults, that there's also a definitional struggle that goes on in the social and cultural world that's a little different than us just kind of approaching this as a social scientific category. So, getting to a definition of what the hell is it that a cult is? Well, there's a number of things, and I pull some of this from Zuckerman. First off, a cult is a new organization. It's not a spin-off. So when we think of Martin Luther at the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, yeah, he was starting a new organization with the Lutheran Church and whatnot, but he was starting it already from having been, he was a Catholic priest. So there was already pre-existing structure of seminaries and churches and things like that. So he didn't start it totally from new. Another thing with cults is it's usually a new idea or a new vision, all right? So again, looking at Martin Luther, yeah, he had some new religious ideas, but they were based in kind of the stream of Christianity. Whereas with cults, you think of Scientology, it's a totally new organization that doesn't predate the 1950s. It's a new group of people with new houses of study and gatherings and books and all that sort of stuff, which express a new idea, a new vision of L. Ron Hubbard, this Dianetic vision, okay? So newness is important here, both in terms of organization and ideas. Now, because of this, or maybe to reinforce this, cults are oftentimes very isolated. We rarely hear about cults. At any given moment, there's probably dozens or hundreds of cults in the United States, but for the most part, they're isolated. And isolation is what often drives a cult. It it brings it to life. So if you have a new organization and new ideas, it's usually hard to kind of get mass support. So a cult will work on very small, dense social networks. So a cult will usually reach out to certain persons or types of people that are connected with people that are already in the cult. And then by isolating people, by keeping small, the cult continued to reaffirm itself and to say, like, we have this special organization, we have this special vision, and so therefore our isolation is important just to kind of keep us going. And then they will oftentimes, with new members, cults will have dense social networks where they'll say, leave behind old friends, leave behind old families. Your cult, this group is your new family, and thereby keeping the cult going by not having people drawn off by other social relationships. And then because of all this, cults usually are small in number. So a lot of times we don't talk about successful cults. We could probably look at the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, as a successful cult. But what's interesting, all right, now catch this, is that to be quote-unquote mainstream and successful now, they don't have a lot of the features of a cult anymore. So some of their ideas that were strange at the time in the late 1800s, polygamy, or in the 1960s, racist tendencies in terms of who could be leaders in the church, those are gone now. And that's partly because of outside pressure and this kind of dance of outside pressure and the cult wanting to be legitimate makes changes that then in the end make it not a classic cult, because the ideas are more familiar, the organization is long-standing, the group is not isolated any longer, and there's large numbers now. It's not just small numbers anymore. So these are some key characteristics of what make up a cult. Okay? Now, why is it that cults form? Well, we can think of this answer in two reasons. One, there is the specific ideographic reason a cult forms. And what I mean here is telling the story of a particular cult. So Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, book, person, 1950s, 1960s, boom, that's how that cult formed, okay? So we could give a specific ideographic reason for every cult. But we can also give a kind of more social setting or social conditions of why cults form. So a good example of this is that in the 1700s and 1800s in Polynesia, we had the rise of something what's known to those who study it as cargo cults. And these were basically islands and societies that pre-existed colonialism, and they had specific economic forms and religious forms. And what happens when the Europeans come over with military dominance, new cultural ideas, new economic systems where they connect these formerly isolated societies? You get crisis. You get kind of breaking down of a worldview, breaking down of an old social system, breaking down of an old economic system, and you get the rise of these cargo cults, which are based on with charismatic individuals, new ideas, new organizations, and so by using this as an example, we see that there are conditions in world history and in society and economics that allow for the rise of cults. It's these conditions of kind of clashing and bringing together and actually destroying kind of old ways of living.